So I've been involved in trials for several decades now, and the person who's taught me most about trials and trial management is Barbara Farrell, who's been involved in a huge number of trials for all sorts of things. And she wrote in the BMJ some years ago, trial management involves communication, ethical marketing, and common sense. Marketing something as nebulous as a trial is difficult, exciting, and challenging. And what I want to try and do is just give you an idea of the basic principles of marketing as applied to clinical trials, and a bit about, and just some sort of practical examples of how I kind of learned through doing about what marketing is. So I was involved, I set up and ran between 1993 and 1997 the International Stroke Trial. It was absurdly ambitious plan to recruit 20,000 patients whose stroke had started within the last 48 hours. And the patients were to be allocated to aspirin, heparin, both or neither. These are all clot-preventing treatments, with the aim of getting 99% follow-up for outcome at 6 months, which was whether the patient was either dead or alive but disabled. And we started out with a small pilot study with aiming to get a few hundred patients to try and get us towards MRC funding for a large trial. I have to say that trials like this are really no longer feasible, very lightweight, very simple. But what they do provide is some interesting background in marketing. So the trial involved 36 countries, 467 hospitals, and 19,435 patients. And I have to say, when we got to the end of the study, we were pretty amazed that we actually made it. And it was only a few years later that I began to understand what it was that we'd been doing that might have contributed to making that sort of trial feasible on a small budget. And the person to thank for this is Ian Roberts. And Ian is a former paediatrician, but now really a clinical trialist with an interest in trauma. And he'd been involved in the CRASH trial, which was testing corticosteroids in patients who'd had a head injury. And he was having trouble recruiting. And he went on a yoga holiday in Greece. And he met a chap called David Francis. And they were just sitting having a beer and discussing Ian's problems, trying to recruit 20,000 patients with head injuries. And it wasn't going well. And Dave Francis said to him, "You've got a marketing problem." And Ian just sort of looked slightly fuddled at this. And so they had another beer and chatted about it. And this is the result of that discussion, which was this paper. And in many ways, this is a kind of seminal paper. And when I read this paper, I had my light bulb moment, just understanding as to the sort of things that one does in trials that make people want to take part, either as patients or as clinicians. So this paper is well worth reading. I'll give you the reference again at the end, but it's a short, simple, open access paper that merits a careful read and then applying the principles in your own trial. So if we look back at IST-1 and just try and think about some of the things that we did then to try and make it marketable. And these are the 4 key areas that Ian and Dave Francis identified in their paper. So building brand values, product and market planning, making the sale, and maintaining engagement. So we'll start with the first quadrant, building brand values. So the first thing you need to do is develop brand values and then go on from there. Okay, so for IST-1, the brand values were that this was a legitimate thing to be looking at. Clot-preventing treatments for stroke. There was a lot of confusion, a lot of debate. Stroke was a huge problem, 16 million patients worldwide having a stroke. So this was generally agreed by by people who looked after stroke patients a burning scientific and clinical question, and at the time there was little else that one could do. So it was clearly a legitimate trial to be doing, and because it was investigator-led and being done independent of pharma, that gave it some additional legitimacy. It clearly appeared to be prestigious because it was built on the prestige of two earlier trials led, one by Charles Muller, who was my then boss, and by colleagues in Oxford running the IST trials, these very large trials in myocardial infarction. And because it adopted a similar philosophy to IST, we were kind of blessed with that prestige of those very important investigator-led trials. And we were able to signal prestige by the fact that we eventually did get MRC, Medical Research Council, and European Union funding. And so that, again, is a sign of scientific value. We also signaled worthiness by emphasizing to potential investigators that this was an opportunity wherever they were working, be it in a fairly well-developed country like UK, or in less well-developed parts like South Africa, Eastern Europe, that they could join a large international research effort to try and tackle this problem of stroke. And people were attracted by that. And this was then seen as a new approach to acute stroke treatment that doctors in general hospitals could take part in. So it was those brand values seemed to be an important part of the trial. When it came to the next process, which is product and market planning, and again, when you're thinking about buying something, or whether you want when you're thinking about a purchase, if it's easy to buy it, then you'll be more likely to buy it. And I think the Kindle is an ideal example of buying a book. It's ridiculously easy now. All you do is press a button and it arrives in your hand seconds later. But that's a simple, complete process for buying a book. And in that process has overcome any resistance you might have had of going down to the bookshop to buy a book. And it's got a built-in marketing plan. It knows what you've read in the past and makes suggestions about what you want to buy in the future. So how do we think about this product and market planning in the context of stroke or clinical trials? Well, when we did the pilot phase, we did a number of things which, in retrospect, provided the ingredients for a marketable trial. The first thing was we had a pretty large randomized feasibility phase, vanguard phase, call it what you like, which was randomized, and we were able to test the procedures. Now, the procedures were already based to some extent on the IST trials, which had gone for extreme simplicity, and we'd adapted them a bit for stroke, but again, we found a few bugs, and we kept trying to make it simpler and smoother to run. We really simplified the consent process for patients, and we also worked hard to try and identify things that would help busy doctors see why participating in this trial might be good for them or good for their hospital. And we also tried to make sure that the trial design, we weren't asking people to do things that they would not normally do in routine practice. So as far as possible, so for example, in the UK and other countries, doing a brain scan quickly within the first few hours of stroke onset was very difficult. So we had a design which said, if you can do a scan before you randomize the patients, go ahead, do the scan, and then randomize. But if there's going to be a delay, don't go ahead and randomize them and do the scan after randomization. And so we stratified randomization, so we looked at those randomised with and without a CT scan, and that in itself was very helpful. It enabled lots of patients to be recruited, but it also provided explicit evidence about the effects of starting clot-preventing treatments in patients who haven't had a scan before the treatment was started. And the other thing was Richard Lindley, who was my then research fellow but is now a professor of geriatric medicine in Sydney, he, by virtue of being a geriatrician, understood a lot about the treatment of older people with stroke and was also able to engage with specialists in medicine for the elderly around the world. And so, because I'm a neurologist by trade and he's a medicine for the elderly specialist, he, if you like, broadened the market, because if I talked to neurologists, I kind of spoke the language of neurology, and Richard spoke the language of geriatric medicine. And that enabled many more hospitals and clinicians to feel involved in the trial. And so that was clearly, in retrospect, an important aspect of making a marketable trial. And this is often the case, that the chief investigator of a trial will have a track record in a particular disease or a particular treatment, and it's working with that individual that provides some of the marketability of the trial. I mean, there are many other things that may attract people to a trial, but they, if you like, that clinical community feeling may well be important. As I mentioned previously, the materials were extremely simple. I think it's very difficult to do trials this simple now, but simplification did make the trial very attractive. People said, oh, yeah, is that all we've got to do? Yeah, I could do that. And the protocol was a very slim document of about 20 pages. And this folder here that you see is all that you needed to randomise the patient. So you needed your hospital's identity number, the clinician who was involved in running the trial at that centre. There was a one-page protocol summary which explained everything you had to do. This was the randomisation notepad. You filled in a few details, you made a phone call, and then recorded the treatment allocation down here. And then there was a simple one-page form to be completed at 7 days. And this was the patient information leaflet. An A5 piece of paper, there was nothing to sign, you just wrote it in the notes. So all the processes were super simple. And clearly that was a major factor. Now, we'll roll the clock forward a number of years to 2000, when we went on to the IST-3 trial. IST-2 was a trial that nearly happened but didn't. So when we were thinking about IST-3, we had a very different trial to think about. And again, given our experience, we decided we needed a proper marketing plan. So this was a randomized trial of the clot-busting drug TPA. Again, very similar, simple outcome, proportional patients alive and independent at 6 months. Randomization was initially by a touch-tone telephone system, and I'll come back to that later. Ambitious target of 6,000 patients. Lots of people said it was completely impossible, and the largest trial up until that point had been about 800 patients. But we knew we would face difficulties, and so we set about doing various things, which again, given that the marketing paper wasn't published, I think, until 2007, we didn't quite realize what we were doing, but we were actually applying the principles in that paper. So the first thing was, this trial, the market, if you like, was for older people. Up until this point, thrombolysis had been used in relatively young stroke patients, but we were interested in seeing whether it might be used in older patients in whom the balance of risk and benefit might be very different, and indeed because the risks might be higher. So there were some challenges for recruitment here that we could foresee. Firstly, if you have a stroke, your cognitive abilities are impaired and you may therefore have difficulty giving informed consent, and if you've got a paralysed arm, written consent would almost certainly be impossible. It was a time-critical treatment. Patients had to be randomised and treated within 6 hours of onset, so there wasn't time for prolonged consideration of consent, and the risks were real. We estimated that there was about a 1 in 25 risk of fatal intracranial bleeding with the treatment, and we were worried about how we might sensibly put the balance of risk and benefit to people who were very unwell and not mentally in a position to give fully informed consent. So Richard Lindley and a Dutch qualitative researcher, Liedeke Kloeps, got together and did some qualitative work, firstly with some volunteers from the Morningside branch of the Scottish Old Aged Pensions Association, and here they are, and another group of older people. And they had some focus group discussions, and they also they asked people to complete a questionnaire, and then at the focus groups they described thrombolysis, they discussed it, and those meetings were recorded and analysed. And they also met and discussed the trial with stroke patients and carers on a stroke rehabilitation ward. And in the meetings with older stroke-free people, some interesting things came out. So as you might expect, about 10%, 9–10% considered that thrombolysis was too risky for them. But nearly 90% were prepared to accept the risks of thrombolysis within a trial because the treatment offered the prospect of surviving free of disability. And almost 90% said they would be happy to give consent for a trial like IST-3 comparing thrombolysis with control. And most were willing to take that sort of risk to avoid disability. And participants were very clear that they considered disability equal to death, and it was something to be avoided. And they also said very interestingly, if they were unable to give consent, their next of kin should be approached. And out of all of this work, several things emerged. The patient information leaflet was hugely simplified, and on advice from the various people that were consulted, we described the natural history of untreated stroke in much more detail. We were much more graphic about what would happen without treatment, but we were also quite clear, we said in the information leaflet, because we estimated that this would be treating older, more severe strokes, but the risk of bleeding, fatal bleeding, might be around 4%, which was higher than that in previous trials. It had been about 3%. But the focus groups were very clear. They said, if you spell it out in numbers, that will be fine. We just will, you know, if we were having to consider this either for ourselves or for a relative, knowing the number, not just some vague statement about you might die with treatment, would be helpful. So that's what we did. And interestingly, the number we chose, 4%, proved to be correct. And so we also set about a marketing plan, and we had national coordinators who organised local meetings in each of the participating countries. We had lots of teleconferences. We obviously invited all the centres who'd been involved in our previous trials to consider joining this one. We did a lot of things across a range of activities to try and market the trial. And I'll talk about most of these along the way. And so it's a multi-approach, if you like, to try and bring the trial to people's attention, to get them to join the study, the sites to join, and various ways of trying to help participants recruit subjects. So this is part of making the sale, which is the next aspect of marketing. So if you've got you've got good brand values, you've got a marketable, simple product, you then need to go out and get people to actually buy it. And in this case, that means join the trial and start recruiting patients. So one strategy was champions and agents of change, and they are pretty important. So we have national coordinators. Here's Manuel Correa from Portugal, Graham Venables, who did sterling work going around the UK, getting his fellow clinicians to join the trial. And this is Eva and Veronica Murray, eminent Swedish physician who did a lot of work getting collaboration in Sweden, and this is Stefano Ricci at a meeting of Italian collaborators. And one of the key principles, if you're going to have champions and agents of change, and if they organise a meeting, they would do the speaking. I would go along and do a bit, and I would encourage them, but it would be basically, the general principle is you give leadership, you give responsibility and recognition to the people who are doing this work. And that's a very key part of why people engage with research. They do a lot of work and they do it for free because they get something out of it. And it may not be money, but they get other things which they consider valuable. And of course, so for example, in Italy and Portugal, the meetings were always in the local language, and questions would always be in the local language, but translated into English if I was there. And the other thing is that if you get people to talk at meetings about a trial, and that means they learn about it, and you know, it does strengthen their, if you like, their being a champion. If you just go along and do the talking, they're in passive mode and they just sit there and listen. Whereas if you get them to talk and get people in the audience to stand up and talk about their experiences, that's an important part of it, achieving engagement and changing people's behaviour. And so at a meeting like this, if you've got people who are a bit doubtful, you get one of the people who's successful to stand up and talk about their experiences of how they managed to recruit these difficult patients or how they've overcome difficulties. And it is an important part in multi-centre collaborative trials to building esprit de corps, building the, if you like, the champions to really take the lead and bring their fellows along with them. And of course, you have to have a multi-level message and always, always, always recognising the contributions of others. So, for example, we had a very good team in Southampton, so we made sure that we got their photograph into the newsletter. And when there were conferences, you know, we would offer people the opportunity to present the trial at local conferences or local meetings and so on. So that not only would we spread the message amongst our group, but we would encourage members within the group to spread the message further. And of course, in the 21st century, a website's a pretty key part of any trial, and this is what the IST-3 website used to look like, and there was a button in the middle which made it easy to randomise patients. It's pretty simple and clean, but there was various things that you could get updates on, and lots of training materials, and also recent slide presentations so that people could download slide sets and go and present them at their own meetings, say what they were doing in the trial. And here, so for example, we had a meeting in Barcelona back in 2010, and people, here were links to the slides that people could upload. And then we also, because centres were beginning to learn about how to use this thrombolysis treatment, we also had some training about how to set up and run a thrombolysis centre. And obviously, in whatever trial you're doing, training in something is often important, and in many sites, learning, engaging staff, be it nurses or doctors, in research they find it interesting, and they learn new stuff. Again, if you can make that accessible, that learning and development, then that's again good reinforcement about the trial. So at conferences we would have a stand. So here we are. Here's Vera and Sheila, programmer and data officer, meeting up with our Italian friends, and big logo in the background. So lots of branding, and we shared we often, because stands at conferences are expensive, we would negotiate a special rate from the conference organisers because we were an academic group, and we would share it with other trials. So we would have a stand that represented 2 or 3 academic trials, and then that gave us an opportunity to meet people involved in the trial who'd come to the conference, you know, build the esprit de corps, and it was a point of contact where they could come and discuss problems or update us on things. And it was obviously, again, a way of marketing the trial to people not yet involved in it, recruiting new centres or encouraging centres that were in the trial to do better. One of the other things about maintaining engagement in trials is what Ian Roberts refers to as moments of truth. And when Ian gives this lecture, he uses this story, which I've lifted directly from him. And this picture, we'll imagine, tells a little story. So this man is a flight attendant, and this woman is a wealthy lady in business class, and he's just spilt some coffee on her very expensive designer dress. Now let's imagine they're flying with British Airways. So she's a very important customer to British Airways. So this interaction could go one of 2 ways. If he handles it right, and she's made to feel a valued customer of British Airways, she will remain loyal to British Airways. And if he gets it wrong, she will never fly with that airline again. And it's exactly the same with clinical trials. If you have an interaction with a collaborator or an investigator that goes badly, you may lose them to the trial irrevocably. So in this case, it might go well if he says, look, I'm really sorry, you know, we'll clean up your dress. As soon as we land at Heathrow, we'll take, you know, we'll take your dress off and get it cleaned, and we'll post it to you, and I'll ensure that you get compensation. And just for now, would you like a glass of champagne? And you know, and several you know, conciliatory gestures, completely admitting fault, even if it wasn't his fault that he'd spilt the coffee on her. If, on the other hand, he just says, oh, well, that's a standard compensation package, fill this form in when you get to Heathrow, and we'll see if the airline can do something. That would not be good. Okay, so that's that example. But when you come to a trial, similar things happen. So, for example, when we started out with IST-3, we had a telephone randomisation system that was based on a touch-tone phone system, which had prompts in English. We then developed some prompts in Italian for those phoning in from Italy, but we all found the system difficult, and because this was a time-critical process, everybody, but particularly non-English speakers, found it very difficult and very stressful, and randomizations failed in several cases. And so, because we had that, we responded, and we listened to people, and we said, okay, we're going to introduce a web-based randomization system, which by 2006 was then feasible, and so we set that up. But the other thing we did, which we had from the beginning of the trial, to be honest, was that we had a sort of multi-level crisis support system for investigators wanting to recruit patients. So the trial office staff were trained that they had to be friendly and helpful whenever anybody phoned the office, that they had to answer the phone quickly, and if there was anything that was remotely clinical, then it would get answered, And if it was an urgent clinical question, we had a 24-hour helpline. And the helpline was manned by the chief investigator, i.e. me, or my co-chief investigator, who by then was Richard Lindley, working in Australia. And because he was 12 hours ahead, we could, between us, provide pretty good 24-hour cover so that if somebody was having a problem, they could have an immediate response from somebody who was wide awake and who could tell them what to do, or could discuss the case, or could help them through. And that, I think, was, people were just amazed. You know, they had a problem in the middle of the night, they got on the phone, and somebody would either get the randomization system to work, or could just randomize the patient offline. We had a neat little offline randomization system. Or if they were unsure about a clinical question as to whether they could or could not randomize a patient, or what they should do if something went wrong with the patient after the treatment, we were always there. And I think that made a huge difference to investigators, and it was a very important part of, if you like, the marketing of the trial. So I think as a general principle, the investigators, the collaborators in your trial are the trial. Problems are inevitable, and whether or not it's your fault, you've always got to be polite, even if people are very angry. You've always got to be quick to apologize, even if it's not your fault, and you've got to make maximal effort to put things right as quickly as possible, to keep those moments of truth being positive. So we've talked about ensuring positive moments of truth. We just think a bit about these last two, providing frequent positive reinforcement. Oops. So again, positive reinforcement, thanks and appreciation in correspondence and newsletter, people named in the newsletter on the website, recognized, their photograph appeared. They got small expensive payments for sending materials in, sending their forms in to cover the postage. Lots of people liked certificates when they'd completed the training, or when they'd attended a training workshop or a meeting. And then, of course, we also published a protocol, and we managed, because it was the online journal Trials, we managed to get a lot of authors on the list, which again went down very well. And of course, because it was a protocol, it was a highly cited paper. And as I mentioned, our trial staff were lovely people. There's Sheila, there's Eleni, who handled all the imaging, and they had a lovely relationship with people. They would send emails saying, "Oh, thanks for sending in your outcome data. And what's the weather like in Bournemouth? Or how are things in Perugia in Italy? And oh, and you know, Stefano's wife's just had a baby," and so on and so on. So that there was a lot of chit chat along with the trial related stuff. And again, people, nurses and doctors, you know, really appreciated that kind of friendly approach. And of course, the trial staff liked it. They felt they were part of the family doing this important work. So that was a big plus. As I mentioned in relation to IST-1, but it was also very true in IST-3, we had to try and get the trial to fit into routine practice. So the randomization procedure collected all the baseline data during the initially phone call and then subsequently just online via the web. It took about 5 minutes or less to put the data in and get the treatment allocation. We asked for a brain scan at 24 to 48 hours, again, because that was when most people, as part of their routine stroke treatment scan practice, would do a repeat scan, and as again, a very simple paper outcome form which could be completed while the patient was still in hospital, or even if they'd been discharged, just from looking through the routine hospital notes. And you didn't need to do any special assessments at that point to complete the form. And patients were then followed up by postal questionnaire or by telephone interview from the trial office and not by the investigator. So it was a kind of randomized and forget trial. And then finally, and this is my last slide, marketing the trial results. And of course, this is something which again needs to be planned for. We aim to maximise transparency. We register the trial, we publish the protocol, we publish an update article describing baseline characteristics and various changes to the trial design during its rather long gestation, again published online in the journal Trials. And we also published a statistical analysis plan. Sorry, that was actually published in the International Journal of Stroke. And then we had a very explicit dissemination strategy, a primary journal publication with linked press coverage, and then pre-planned secondary publications involving as many of the investigators as possible, and getting the investigators to present those results in their own countries and then within their own centres. We also had an interesting arrangement with the UK guideline authors so that they could have some advance notice of what the main results would be before we published them, so that they could be incorporated in the update of the guideline, and of course the usual sort of presentations and a bit of social media. I dipped my toe into Twitter, and that was of interest. It would perhaps help a little bit in spreading the word. And again, another part, of course, was an explicit plan for data sharing to say, yes, the data would be made available in the long run. So that's all I wanted to say. Sorry, I've been banging on for a rather long time now, but and the answer to the question is, will the slides be available? Yes, I hope they will be.
Yes, thanks very much, Peter. That was fascinating. And yes, the slides will be available, and this is actually being recorded as well, so it will be up on our website very soon. Thanks so much for that overview. We have a couple of questions that have come in, so I might just pose them to you now, Peter, and everyone who's still with us, just to continue adding your questions to the Q&A or the chat facility. I'll get them and I can pose them to Peter here. Peter, some really interesting oversights into the different steps of a trial and how to make it, I suppose, more user-friendly for everyone involved. You spoke a little bit about simplification of procedures, and I spoke a lot about recruitment. I'm just wondering, do you find any sort of resistance amongst those that were designing the trial, so the researchers? Did they have, I suppose sometimes researchers have a tendency to overcomplicate procedures. Was there a resistance when it was suggested to actually make things simplified and to run things better, maybe into routine care? Or is there any example of that, or was that something that you didn't find?
Well, I think that was it was an iterative process between ourselves and so Richard, Lindy, and I, who are both clinicians who've been exposed to the sort of extreme simplicity of the IST trials. So we both started from a point of wanting simplicity. So, but you're correct. There was quite a lot of negotiation between ourselves and other clinicians in trying to get the trial design simple enough that we knew we could do it, but detailed enough so that the broader scientific community would accept it. Yeah. And so, yes, so that in a sense, it wasn't such a problem within the group, but it was, if you like, battling it out with our peer reviewers and battling it out with the wider scientific community about doing it this simple is the only way of doing it at this scale.
Yeah, and did you find there was maybe compromise on some elements then, that maybe you had to kind of go, okay, we've enough, for example, questions, we have to pare back on something? Or
I guess, well, we were lucky in that we'd had, from our prior experience, we kind of knew what the core needed to be. So I guess the main thing is the persuading people that collecting a small amount of data on a large number of subjects is often much better than getting a lot of data on a small number of subjects. Yes. So that's a very broad scientific purpose. And I guess the other dimension to the argument was trying to choose measures of outcome and measures of baseline that were sensitive and appropriate. And of course, this comes down to the whole question of core outcome sets, which Paula Williamson was talking about at the launch meeting. And I think in if one has got a well-defined core outcome set, then that does make life easier for saying, okay, this is what we're going to go for, and no more than that. I'm involved in another trial called Focus at the moment, where it's against stroke patients, but patients are being followed up by a postal questionnaire, which there's quite a questionnaire burden. These folks are having trouble. So the follow-up is, if they don't send a questionnaire, we have to do a phone interview. And the phone interviews are really struggling with the questionnaire burden. There's quite a lot of, if you might say, pushback, saying, well, maybe we shouldn't have ever included this additional instrument because it's such a beast to deal with. So sometimes that's why randomized feasibility phases or vanguard phases are really important, because they then highlight those practical difficulties as to what's going to be doable, what's not. Sorry, that's a long answer to a short question.
No, that's great, thanks. We have another question here from Sinead. She said it was a great discussion on the marketing of trials. Just wondering the impact that components such as a 24-hour helpline would have on the cost effectiveness of the trial. So I suppose, was that examined in the trial that you looked at?
Okay, so there was no cost to it other than paying for the chief investigator's mobile phone. Well, I suppose there was a cost as well, because we had to have a helpline, a phone that could be switched through. But that was relatively straightforward, and because the person carrying the helpline was the chief investigator, there was no salary cost involved.
Okay, and just out of curiosity, did you have many calls? Or?
Yeah. And that's why because it's an emergency trial going on 24/7 worldwide, it was really helpful that there was somebody who was awake and alert in Australia dealing with nighttime calls from Europe, and then during the daytime I could deal with nighttime calls from Australia.
Wow.
But obviously that's only important if you've got a high-risk trial or an emergency treatment trial. A 24-hour helpline isn't necessary for all trials, and doesn't have to be expensive.
Yes, I see your point. That's great. We have another question here from Shona. She wants to know, what is the current feeling about using electronic data capture? There is payoff between reducing the travel burden on participants by employing electronic CROs and the feeling that participants can't or won't use technology. Any thoughts on that?
Well, again, it's I think if people have a range of options for completing their outcomes, one has to find out quite early on in a trial what somebody's preferred method of communication is. And actually the same is true for investigators in a multi-center trial. Some people respond to phone, some people to email, some people only respond to personal, face-to-face contact. And it's exactly the same for participants in the trial. And I think this is part of developing a marketing strategy, is to work out, of the patients that you're going to be dealing with, or research participants, what forms of communication are these type of individuals going to be most comfortable with? And for some, they'll all be happy with a piece of paper. For others, they'll want a range of options. So I'm involved in a trial called Ascend, which started as all being done by post, but it's now starting to use web communication. And there are some people who clearly like using the web, but some of those participants prefer staying with the paper system. So the trial made both available and allowed people to use their preferred method. And I think that's the key, is trying to respond to what people want rather than forcing it on them.
Great, thanks. We have a comment here from Annette. She just wants to hear your comments about the impact of the recent events in the France clinical trial, and maybe the impact that might have on patient recruitment, I suppose globally really, and as well in Europe. If you have any thoughts on that, Peter?
Yes, I mean, I think these things, there are periodic trial-related scandals and disasters. And so there was a scandal in the Netherlands about, well, not a scandal, but a research sort of media storm about a trial related to bleeding in the brain. There was another one, of course, the Northwick Park incident. And so it all depends if the investigators are prepared. Obviously, in a risk assessment of the trial, when you're designing the trial, you have to prepare for disasters. And in the IST-3 trial, where we knew there would be disasters, we did a lot of work when training sites to say, look, you can't start recruiting this trial in the belief that you're going to get away without some patients dying as a result of treatment in the trial. Because, some people were a bit sort of, well, I'm going to recruit a patient and, hope that it goes okay. And we said that that isn't the way it works. You've got to be prepared yourself, you've got to prepare the patients and prepare the nursing staff that things could go badly wrong. And what are you going to do if it does? And so it's a bit the same for a trial. You have to be ready to respond. Now, what happened in France was that this was a commercial study, and the response wasn't that clever. It was, if you've got a well-designed academic trial which is trying to answer an important question, you'll have a group of eminent people who will say, okay, we set about this trial knowing that there might be risks, but we think it's worth taking the risks in order to gain the benefit of a potentially really helpful new treatment. And they can stand up and they can defend the trial. What happened here was that the news got out that people were brain dead, and you were thinking, well, for God's sake, there's just a painkiller. How come people are dying? So the whole way that the news came out was not well handled by the people who were releasing the data. And so you end up with a PR disaster. I mean, there are various examples where if this is something that investigators who run trials have to be really, really aware of. That's why you have a steering committee, that's why you have a data monitoring committee, because they are there to protect the safety and well-being of the participants, and if something goes wrong, they need to be ready to support the trial team in managing a response to a disaster. And so disasters will happen in trials. Drugs and treatments have unanticipated effects, and one has to be ready for that. And if one's not well prepared, that's not a good trial.
Great. Thanks very much, Peter. At first, I'd just like to say thanks again for hosting today's webinar. I think we might leave it at that. We've had some great discussion from our attendees, and just to say thanks very much for everybody who joined us today. The recording of this webinar will be available very shortly this afternoon on our website. Just to also highlight, we have our next webinar, which will be on the 1st of February at 2 p.m. and it's with Dr. Molly Byrne here in NUI Galway from the Health Behaviour Change Research Group, and there's details of that on our website as well. So thanks again to everybody who joined us, and thanks again, Peter, for your time.
Okay, cheerio.